Get the real news at realrawnews.com. Article dated January 29th, 2023, entitled Special Forces Seize Deep State Cloning Lab in Alaska. United States Special Forces on Thursday seized an enemy cloning laboratory near Fort Yukon, Alaska, which held dozens of deep state clones, a source in General Eric M. Smith's office told Real Raw News. The find marks the second time White Hats located carbon copies of deep state politicians. As reported last month, Special Forces on December 22nd found and destroyed a concealed cloning center in the Missouri Ozarks that held replicas of Joseph Biden, Chuck Schumer, and Anthony Fauci. Evidence taken from the lab later led Special Forces to a German-born cloning scientist living in Boston. That individual, whose name remains a mystery, was reportedly arrested and brought to a Marine Corps base for interrogation. Real Raw News asked our source if the scientist divulged the existence and location of the Alaska lab, but he answered nebulously, quote, "We got credible information that was reviewed by General Smith and his council. It was enough to act on." He admitted, though, that the council at first rejected the, quote, credible information. For the remote mountainous terrain of interior Alaska seemed an unlikely place to hide and run a deep state sanctum. Fort Yukon is located on the north bank of the Yukon River at its confluence with the Porcupine River, north of the Arctic Circle, and has a bipolar climate with severe winters and mild summers. Its inhabitants, 583 according to the last census, are Gwich'in natives who live in log buildings. Fort Yukon is disconnected from the Alaska roadways and is accessible only by air. The city's airfield has only a gravel runway that is unable to handle large aircraft needed to transport construction materials for something as grand as a cloning laboratory. And our source said the laboratory was 25 miles north of Fort Yukon. When the council opined on the possibility of clandestinely erecting a bastion in a realm that was frozen solid 8 months a year and largely off-grid, General Smith assuaged their doubts by showing them aerial surveillance footage of a rectangular steel building nestled amid clusters of white spruce. Around the building were several snowmobiles and a large snowplow, and beside the building were concrete pads sizable enough to land a big helicopter, and whoever controlled the facility had recently plowed fresh snow from the helipads. The drone had watched the building like a vulture circling carrion. Dual rotary helicopters like the CH-57 Chinook, which can lift 20,000 pounds, could have ferried equipment between Fairbanks and the lab. After conferring with 19th Special Forces Commander General Smith, picked the unit's soldiers. They underwent Arctic warfare training during Operation Arctic Fox in May 2022 to effect a search and destroy mission if warranted. Ahead of a blistering gunfight that could imperil soldiers' lives, however, he wanted boots on the ground intelligence to supplement the aerial recon, and thus sent a small team posing as National Geographic photographers studying the aurora borealis and a Gwich'in translator to Fort Yukon. General Smith, our source said, wanted to capture the lab intact so White Hats could learn how the deep state was powering them off-grid. In January 20th, plainclothes Special Forces operators landed in Fort Yukon aboard a Cessna Caravan. They hired a Gwich'in guide under the pretense of needing a local to point out propitious spots to photograph the northern lights. The guide chuckled, cautioning them to either sleep in their heated plane or get their affairs in order, for the ice had claimed many intrepid adventurers. They asked whether Fort Yukon received many non-native visitors, and the guide said outsiders had been coming for as long as he'd been alive, 57 years. He must have had a sixth sense, for he penetrated the Special Forces cover story, deducing they had an ulterior motive for coming to Fort Yukon, even though they carried bags laden with cameras, lenses, and tripods. Here you are about them. I hope you're not one of them, the guard said, pointing north into a sudden squall of blinding snow. The Special Forces lead assured the guide that neither he nor his men had knowledge of, quote, them, but he pressed the guide for more information. Their Sherpa said he would introduce them to a Fort Yukon elder who would decide if they were worthy of hearing lore. When the Special Forces lead asked what determined worthiness, the guide said, quote, he'll look at you and know that, and it's customary to bring a gift. Information itself is a gift. Since you're not carrying whale meat, I'm sure a few $100s will do. I'm guessing you didn't travel here without any money or cash. He introduced Special Forces to Fort Yukon's oldest living resident, an 89-year-old man named Tom Eriquas, whose home was little more than a 16 by 20 pitched roof built of logs and tar and heated by a wood stove with a single cooking plate. The guide began to translate, but Eriquas encouraged him to speak English. These men don't speak our language, but we speak theirs, Eriquas said, and lamented that fewer than 300 Alaska and Gwich'in spoke their native tongue anymore. Eriquas entrusted Special Forces with the city's folklore. In the summer of 2013, an unusually warm season, swarms of helicopters, sometimes as thick as a cloud of mosquitoes, appeared in the skies north of Fort Yukon. Tow cables hanging from their fuselage held concrete and steel walls, I-beams, and enormous wooden crates. They came and went day and night, only pausing in the heaviest rains, and men from the helicopters desecrated the forest by felling sacred trees that had stood for hundreds of years. The flights stopped when the snow began to fall, but the helicopters returned the following spring. Eriquas said that the Gwich'in dared not venture to the area, as it was deemed a den of devils or evil. He recalled hearing cacophonous roars as if the earth were split asunder, and after 2 springs and 2 summers, the flights became less frequent. But on some nights, the sky glowed blue, and not from the aurora borealis. He then told Special Forces a tale most people would consider ludicrous. In the spring of 2017, just after the first thaw, a man who looked like and claimed to be President William Jefferson Clinton emerged from the woods on an ATV. He insisted he was Bill Clinton, but had no idea where he was. He said he'd escaped imprisonment and had to notify both his wife and Al Gore that he was still alive. The Gwich'in people, Eriquas said, believed an evil, shape-shifting spirit had haunted Fort Yukon. In 2017, Clinton was 71, with a pitted face and skin like worn leather. The Clinton in Fort Yukon, though, had the visage of a significantly younger man, as he looked during his presidency in the 90s. The Fort Yukon Clinton demanded an immediate flight to D.C., but was told that the next scheduled supply drop, which could bring him to Fairbanks, wouldn't arrive for 2 days. Eriquas told Special Forces that Clinton got back on the ATV and headed east towards the Northwest Territories. If I was a man, he could not survive. If I was that man, if a spirit is somewhere else, Eriquas said. Special Forces flew back to Fairbanks to delay their findings to General Smith at Camp Pendleton. The general, our source said, found the revelations too disquieting to ignore. If the story was true, it meant a Clinton clone had escaped from a cloning lab, and the cloning technology had existed for quite some time. On Thursday, 2 12-man Special Forces detachments arrived at Allison Air Force Base in Fairbanks, from where they were flown on Blackhawks to an LZ a few kilometers east of the alleged cloning lab. Burdened by heavy rucksacks and donned in Arctic gear, they trudged the distance until reaching a vantage point which had given them an unhindered view of a 200 by 160-foot windowless building surrounded by a chain fence and a half dozen sentries armed with automatic rifles. Dressed in black and a white backdrop, the sentinels made easy targets. Special Forces snipers shot them center mass or made their heads explode in a pink mist. With the sentries dispatched, they cut through the fence and breached the entrances with explosives, hurling flashbang grenades inside to stun any occupants within. They shot dead, a half dozen people in white hat lab coats. And another 5 armed sentries. Although some rounds ricocheted and shattered cloning cylinders identical to those discovered in the Missouri Ozarks. Although cylinders housed no Clinton clones, they did contain clones of several deep staters who had only recently risen to prominence: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Cori Bush. Other maturation chambers held facsimiles of Nancy Pelosi and Gavin Newsom. Republicans hadn't been excluded. A section of the buildings had clones of William Barr, General Michael Flynn, Supreme Court Justice Michael Roberts, and yes, Mitch McConnell. Quote, "We have control of it and we are examining the technology," our source said. Needless to say, there are probably more of these places in the country and maybe abroad. I won't lie, we have our work cut out. And they, the deep state, had been at this for a damn long time. That's the end of the article at realrawnews.com.